3 years ago, my parents convinced my husband that he could do better, and when I couldn't give them a grandchild, they all walked out of my life. Fast forward to now, and I recently ran into them with my new baby girl in my arms. This encounter has left me reeling with emotions I thought I'd moved past. For context, I'm 30 now, and I haven't spoken to my parents or my ex-husband, Scott, who is now 33, since the divorce 3 years ago. Growing up, I wasn't mistreated, but my parents always longed for a son. My mother hinted at it more than once, and although I tried to bridge that gap, I could never quite meet their expectations. By the time I reached adulthood, they were the only family I really had. My grandparents, aunts, and uncles weren't involved in my life, so I kept reaching out to my parents, clinging to the family connection. Even when they distanced themselves, I held on, hoping that one day they'd embrace me as I was. At 23, I met Scott at a concert, and we hit it off immediately. They called me more often and started asking about my life in ways they never had before. The change felt so good that I didn't question it. As my relationship with Scott grew, so did their presence. We felt like a real family for the first time, so when Scott proposed after 2 years, I was overjoyed. I thought everything was falling into place, and my relationship with my parents had finally blossomed. Scott and I married after 3 years together, and life as newlyweds was wonderful. But 6 months in, my parents began hinting about wanting grandchildren. I was only 26, not ready for that step, and wanted to enjoy married life a little longer. However, the pressure got to me, and I brought it up with Scott, who was excited about starting a family sooner. His enthusiasm convinced me, and we began trying. Months went by with no success, and when we saw a specialist, the news was devastating. I was infertile. Hearing this crushed me, and it only got worse when I told my parents. They didn't offer comfort. My father walked out in disappointment, and my mother barely spoke a word. Scott and I discussed IVF, but it was expensive and success wasn't guaranteed. We eventually decided to save up for the treatments, temporarily putting aside our dream of starting a family. Though we accepted the situation, my parents were furious. They stopped visiting and cut communication. No matter how much I tried to explain, they weren't interested in hearing it. They saw my infertility as a failure and shut me out completely. After weeks of feeling torn, I called them and voiced my pain. I confronted them for treating me so harshly simply because I couldn't give them a grandchild right away. I even questioned if they would be fit as grandparents, given the cold treatment they showed me, especially for something outside my control. But they doubled down, claiming I was worthless as a woman if I couldn't bear children. It was a horrible realization, yet it finally made me understand how little they truly valued me. After cutting ties with my parents, I confided in Scott, hoping for support. Initially, he seemed to be there for me, but as days turned into weeks, I sensed a shift. He became distant, and I was already carrying so much pain that acknowledging his withdrawal felt like too much to bear. I tried to ignore it, pouring myself into our marriage and doing everything I could to keep us together, but he became colder and detached. Finally, he came home one day with divorce papers, declaring that he couldn't stay any longer. I wasn't completely shocked, but I was devastated. I pleaded, suggesting we try IVF in the future, but he was resolute. The divorce dragged on for 7 agonizing months. I was heartbroken and utterly alone. Then, as if things couldn't get worse, I learned from relatives that Scott had moved in with my parents. Desperate for answers, I contacted his parents, who shared that my parents had been in Scott's ear, convincing him he could do better than me. Although Scott's parents disagreed with his decision to leave, they explained he'd cut them off too, unwilling to hear any other perspective. It was clear that my parents had used my infertility as a tool to manipulate him into abandoning me. Their desperation for a grandchild led them to turn Scott against me. After the divorce, I felt completely shattered. But eventually, I found strength, promising myself I'd never look back. I packed up my life and moved to the suburbs, landing a new job, updating my appearance, and blocking my parents and Scott from my life entirely. I made it known to friends and family that I wanted no updates about them, and remarkably, everyone respected my wishes. Over the past 3 years, I've been in therapy, rebuilding my life and discovering who I am on my own terms. The one dream I still held on to, though, was becoming a mother. My desire for a child hadn't faded, even if I was without a husband or family. Last year, I decided to start IVF with an anonymous donor. After years of heartbreak, I welcomed my precious baby girl into the world 4 months ago, and life has been beautiful since. A few days ago, while out on a walk with my daughter, I unexpectedly ran into my parents and Scott. Seeing them hit me like a ton of bricks. I froze, unable to process the shock as they approached. They immediately focused on my baby, surprised that I, their infertile daughter, was holding a child. I told them the truth, unable to hide my frustration, and turned to leave. But Scott stopped me, telling me how glad he was to see me. He mentioned that he'd been thinking about me and saw this as a sign that we should try to reconnect. My parents urged me to invite them in, acting like the past 3 years hadn't happened, as though we could pick up where we'd left off. I was appalled by their arrogance. Did they truly believe I'd welcome them back into my life? It had taken years to heal, and I was still working through everything in therapy. I was furious, and I snapped. I told them I'd rather invite a pack of wild animals into my home than let them back in, as they'd still be better company. I told them that their sudden interest in my life was only because I now had a child. My parents were only excited to reconnect, because they thought they'd be getting a grandchild, and Scott clearly thought he could just waltz back in now that I'd had a child. They had spent so long treating me as if my worth was tied to my ability to bear children, overlooking the fact that I was a person with real feelings. At that moment, I was done pretending. I reminded them that when I'd needed them most, they'd all walked out. I vented years of anger, telling them to leave me alone. Usually mild and quiet, I was yelling on the street, pouring out everything I'd been holding back. Finally, I stormed off, going home to be alone with my daughter. For the next few days, I was mentally drained, replaying the encounter in my mind over and over, doubting myself, wondering if I'd done the right thing. Then, last night, an unknown number called. I don't normally answer those, but something compelled me to pick up. It was Scott, and I could hear my parents in the background. He asked me to give him another chance, and to let him explain. Against my better judgment, I listened as he admitted he knew he'd hurt me, that their hopes for a grandchild and disappointment over my infertility led to their poor choices. He said he wanted another chance to be in my life and to prove his sincerity. I took a deep breath and told him I wasn't interested in his apologies or his attempts to rewrite history. I made it clear that they hadn't cared about me before, they only cared now because they'd seen me with a baby. Just as I was about to hang up, my parents spoke up, accusing me of being selfish and saying that my reaction to my infertility had pushed everyone away. They claimed they'd needed time to process the news, and that I'd unfairly demanded support without considering their feelings. Listening to their twisted logic, I felt the years of gaslighting that had kept me doubting myself, and I hung up, cutting them off for good. Afterward, I reached out to Scott's parents to understand why he'd stayed so close to mine. They explained that Scott had always been close with them, but that my parents had actively sought him out, even inviting him over when I couldn't join. They had lavished him with attention, treating him like the son they'd always wanted. They'd even given him money for IVF, which I hadn't known. All this time, my parents had been feeding him the idea that he deserved someone better. Eventually, they convinced him to leave me, driving him to end our marriage. This revelation gave me the closure I needed. My parents' manipulation went deeper than I'd realized, but it no longer mattered. They were out of my life, and that's where they'd stay. A few weeks later, Scott showed up drunk outside my house, demanding to see me. My nanny acted quickly, taking my daughter to safety and alerting me. When I arrived home, the police were there, and I pressed charges, securing a restraining order to protect my family. Now, with the restraining order in place, Scott and my parents are finally out of my life for good. I'm at peace, knowing I have a wonderful life with my daughter, far away from the chaos they brought. And most importantly, I am determined to be a far better parent than the examples I had growing up.
Did you hear? Dylan learned how to do crystal readings on Etsy because he's trying to make it big as an online spiritual healer. He doesn't believe in any of it,